Welcome to RetroBaking. My name is Melinda, and I'm going to walk you through how to bake a vintage Wilton character cake from start to finish, even if you're not a great baker. I'm a home baker, so that means that my kitchen is not a professional set, the process is sometimes messy, and things don't always work out perfectly. But I'm here to tell you that is okay. You can totally do this. So before we dive into the baking, I want to give you a little bit of background on the Wilton company and how these cake pans even came to exist. Back in 1929, Dewey McKinley Wilton was an Illinois-based pulled sugar expert who founded Wilton and traveled around to hotels to teach pastry chefs how to level up their sweets. When his son Norman returned home from being a fighter pilot in World War II, he saw very few jobs for returning soldiers like himself. This inspired the family to begin running the Wilton School of Cake Decorating out of their home, teaching decorating skills to veterans. The mission of Wilton has always centered on empowering home bakers to make beautifully decorated cakes themselves, rather than having to buy them from a store. Starting in the late 50s, shaped pans were Norman's idea for creating fun cakes that had the design baked right in to make decorating much easier. In the late 60s, Norman reached out to, no surprise, Disney to get an officially licensed pan made for children's birthday cakes. The pans were developed by Wilton based on artwork provided by the owner of the licensed character, like Disney, Mattel, or Lucasfilm. Wilton adapted the artwork into a pan format and then made test pans to bake and decorate it for approval. Once it was approved, they made the pan out of anodized aluminum. If you scroll through Pinterest, you'll see modern cakes that tend to be tall, covered in fondant rather than piped buttercream, and have lots of bells and whistles. Sheet cakes and character cakes, on the other hand, may be seen by some as outdated or overly simplistic. But to me, they're an easy way to get into baking, and they're fun cakes for remembering what 80s and 90s birthday parties were really like. One of the biggest tips that I can give you about this process is to make your cake over several days instead of doing it all in one day, and to make sure that you have all of the tools you're going to need before you even start. You also want to make sure that, of course, you have your cake mix, any kind of specialty items or tools that you're going to need, and any additional decorating items, like if you needed to put M&Ms on the cake, for example, or if it's a birthday cake, candles. The other thing that you need to think about in advance is how you're going to display and store the cake. So these cakes tend to be quite large, so using a regular cake platter often will not work. So you're going to need to measure your pan and see what the dimensions are, and then plan accordingly. You can get a cake board that's big enough, usually at a big box store near you, or you can make your own, which is what I opted to do. And then you can also find a cake box either at your local bakery or, again, at a big box store. One of the first things you're definitely going to need is the Wilton cake pan. So you can usually find those on eBay. You do want to make sure that it comes with the instruction manual, because it's going to tell you exactly how to decorate, what tip sizes you need, and how much icing color you need for each color. It also may come with one of these little applications that you can put onto your cake to avoid having to draw like Superman's face, for example. And so you'll want to make sure that if your pan needs that it comes with your pan. So we are about 1 week out from the bake, and I'm going to go ahead and make all the frosting today so that the colors can develop in the fridge for a week, especially the reds and the blacks. It really does help them intensify and get where you want them to go. So I've got all of my ingredients here and all of the equipment that I'm going to need, and I'm going to make my frosting from scratch. You, of course, can use whatever kind of frosting you want to use, and then we will come back and I will show you how to color it. Hey, hot tip, make sure you got extra vanilla. For these guys, I do suggest getting this Wilton Twist Quick if you've got a whole lot of colors. And you can reuse this for, like, if you ever do Christmas cookies or anything where you've got a whole bunch of different colors in bags, because it really is going to make what we're going to do a lot easier, and you'll see why when we get there. But inside each bag that I'm about to prepare, I'm going to have one of these couplers sort of already hooked up and ready to go, so that I can use various tips on every color, and I don't have to have separate bags for the star tip versus the round tip. If I want black icing that's round and also black icing that's a star, I can just use the same bag and just change the tips. So that's what we're going to do, and I'm going to show you how to mix the icing up and put it in the bags. I really love the AmeriColor colors. This is a student set, and it comes with 12 different colors, which you can basically use to get any color that you need once you start combining them. I also have a couple extra things, so because I know I'm going to use a lot of black, I made sure to get the super black. And I've also got some black cocoa powder, which when we mix up the black, you're really going to see that this is really, really helpful in getting a nice deep black, because it's very hard with just this to get a black that doesn't look just like a charcoal gray color. And if you put too much of any kind of food coloring in your icing, it's going to taste like a chemical, and that's not delightful. So we always want to strive to be delightful. So once again, we're going to do what? We're going to start low and go slow, because once you put too much color in, there's no going back. So it's better to not have enough than to have too much. So I just put like 1 drop in and stir it and see where that gets us. We're looking for Superman blue. So I'm going to rely on my cameraman here, Tim, to tell me when I have achieved Superman blue. I feel like we've reached probably the saturation of what it can do. I mean, this is a cartoon character approximation.
I think it's pretty close.
I think it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Thank you for pulling up the best Superman.
I ain't no crazy man.
Snobbery. Okay. All right, so now that we have our lovely Superman blue, we are going to take our bag. I think it's easiest, especially if you are not super experienced with this. You can do this with just your hand. You have to sort of fold a little cuff down on the bag. And this is a size 16 bag. You can go up to an 18, but you don't want to go any less than that because, as you can see, it's not that big. So you want to make sure it holds the frosting with enough room so that it's not filled too tall. So you can just take your hand and form a C, and then when you're scooping this in, you can kind of just scoop it into your hand and scoop it in there. But just to show you how to do this the other way, first thing you've got to do is, because we're using the coupler, you're going to take this guy apart. This part is going to go inside the bag. I'm going to take my kitchen scissors, and it's sort of right there. So I just made a little snip, then I'm going to cut it across. So it fits nicely in there, and then this part will screw right up on top of it. And now it's held on there. When we're ready to put a tip on, we just slide it on here, and then there's the other part that screws right on top of there. And then we can change these out without ever having to worry about like this tip being stuck inside the bag, because you technically can just put these tips inside the bag and frost them that way with none of this coupler. So if you only have a couple of colors, then you're fine to just do that. So now we can put this, I'm going to go ahead and put the lid back on this guy. In the glass. These little spatulas are super helpful when you're mixing up this kind of stuff. I'm going to finish this off because this is actually a good bit of frosting. A cup and a half is about as much as you could probably put in one of these. This is why I don't like to do it this way, is because I need to hold the bowl. You gonna give me a hand, Tim?
I'm gonna give you a hand.
Okay, if you just hold, you can hold the edge right there. Perfect.
Let me reposition you. Here we go.
Whee. So I'm just going to sit this here for a second, and I'm going to give this a good scraping. So I can get every last bit of that blue goodness. I feel like it's Smurfs all over again.
Yeah, but this is how Gargamel wanted this much.
All right. So that is our super full bag. And again, you want to have enough room that you can kind of hold on to this at the top and hold it closed, because you have to hold on to that when you start piping your stuff on. So now we only have 11 or 12 more, depending on how you look at it. I like to just put all of the tubes that I'm going to need in one big Tupperware. You may not be needing as many tubes as me, but I just find that this keeps odors out, which is important. For a good black, I like to use a black cocoa powder, and it kind of tastes like Oreos, but it's a nice way to add that in along with the black gel food coloring to really get a nice intense black, especially if you let it sit in the fridge. So one thing that you will note is that a lot of times it gets kind of clumpy inside the thing. So if it's really clumpy and you really are worried about it, like, you probably want to like put it through a sifter, which I am actually going to do because I don't want any clumps in the final product. So you really don't need a ton of it, and you don't have to really measure it. I just put about a tablespoon. Maybe not even a full tablespoon. And then you can add your black food coloring in that. I know I'm just kind of eyeballing it, but the thing is with black, it usually takes a few tries because you're starting off with white. It's just, and this is where letting it sit in the fridge for a few days, up to a week or two even, can really help it develop and get even darker. One thing that I actually like to do, and this is something that I do with paint as well, like when you're painting something that's black, I kind of like to add a little bit of blue, just because it kind of tricks the eye into feeling like it's a little bit richer. It's probably as black as it's going to get, but then again, it's going to sit in the fridge and do its thing. So for red is the other really difficult color to get. It always kind of wants to look pink. So I do recommend the AmeriColor Super Red. In this case, it's for Superman, so it's super appropriate. But we are going to use a good amount of this. You can use other things like beet powder and stuff like that, but really, I think that just a good amount of this and letting it sit in the fridge and develop for a few days at least is your best bet. If you have only got grocery store food coloring, then don't fret. Like, just use what you got and it'll be fine. Like, it's the charm of the cake is that you made it. And it'll be fun either way.
Do you only find the gel ones online, or can you find those in stores?
You can find them at Walmart, and Walmart actually carries a good amount of baking stuff if you're looking for an easy to find big box store. You can also find it at Michael's here in the States. Now overseas, not sure where you would find these things, but you can definitely find them on Amazon. Much like with the frosting, it is a lot easier if you go ahead and bake the cake on a completely separate day than decorating the cake. And I would say also then do that on a separate day from your party or whenever you're planning to serve the cake. So frosting one day, baking one day, decorating one day, party on the fourth day. Just because a lot of this stuff you know, if something goes wrong, it gives you time to fix it. It also makes you less tired because it can take a little while, even though there are some steps where you're just waiting. So Wilton cakes were made to be baked with a cake mix. Now, a lot of people these days have a lot of stigma against using cake mixes because, you know, oh, well, you have to make it from scratch. And that's been sort of a thing ever since the beginning of baking. But cake mixes got really big in the starting right after the war, and then moving into the 50s, they became very popular. And so that was around the time that Wilton was also really ramping up its production of these formed cakes. And so they really just wanted to play off of that. Some of the reasons why are because in the 50s, if you're using a cake mix, then you feel like you're kind of scrimping on your family. And so you would put the extra effort into decorating these very elaborate 50s cakes. If you see them, they're really amazing. Like they'll have football party cakes that look like a football field, or, you know, very elaborate, overly decorated cakes that are very, you know, so those are no longer in vogue, but these cakes grew out of that trend. And so they were definitely made to be used with cake mixes. Now you can use our standard recipe. You're still going to need the 4 to 5 cups of batter. So as long as your recipe yields that, that's fine. But I feel like cake mixes have a really nice place to be used sometimes. Sometimes they're just easier, depending on who your audience is, if it's for children or for people who aren't as discerning about the flavor of a cake. This is an easy option, and as long as you're making homemade frosting, I feel like that's really going to give you more of a wonderful flavor. If you do decide to use a cake mix, there are things that you can do to sort of make the flavor a little bit better. So one of those things is you can use some other kind of liquid instead of just water. Most of them call for some amount of water, oil, and eggs. So you can use milk, you can use sort of half milk, half coffee if it's a chocolate cake. There's all sorts of recipes online that you can go and Google. So look up Dr. Bach's cake mix and you can find all kinds of ways to fix up your cake mix and make it taste really delicious. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up the cake mix, and I'll walk you through how to prepare your pans and get them baked correctly. Okay, let's go. Another thing that you'll notice about a cake mix versus most recipes for cake batter is that this cake mix stuff tends to yield a very thin batter, which in this case can be helpful because it helps get into the nooks and crannies a little bit easier of these pans, which you definitely want to make sure that you do. So if you use butter, it tends to be a little bit thicker, and there also sort of tends to volumize a little bit more. I don't know why that is, but it just seems that way. So I like to use Baker's Joy to prepare my pans. It's the easiest way to do it because it basically has flour inside the cooking spray, and so it really helps the batter not stick into these pans, because that is the main problem you can have with these pans, is your cake can stick inside the pan if you cook it at too high of a temperature, or for too long, or you don't remove the cake from the pan fast enough, or you don't use enough of a coating on the pan. So you want to make sure you get into every nook and cranny of the pan, all around the sides. If you see any spots where it's pooling, you can take like a brush of some kind and just sort of touch it and maybe lightly respray that spot, because you want
left side where the neck meets the shoulder. No, it's starting to round a little bit.
Oh. It's kind of okay. You don't want any huge pools, but you just want to make sure that the detail is going to come through onto your cake, because that's what's going to help you decorate it easily. So Okay, so you can see that I poured it right in the center, but you really need to get it out to the edges of the pan. I like to kind of pound it a little bit to get some of the air bubbles out that you've just put in there by mixing it so much. This particular pan doesn't have a lot of little islands, which is kind of nice. Some of them have like little parts that stick out, and that part will tend to bake a lot faster than your center part, but we should be good with this cake. So now I am going to put this onto a cake pan because you can see that this pan is not super full, but if you make a mix at home, like sometimes you don't want to fill it more than definitely no more than 75% of the way, because it can rise and then overflow and you will have a horrible mess and burning in the bottom of your oven, and believe me, you don't want that. So I just put a pan underneath it for safety. You don't have to put it right on it, you can put it on the shelf below, but you just want to make sure that you have something in place. So we're going to pop this in the oven. I'm actually going to do it like this. We're going to check out, we've had it in there for 30 minutes, that's right in the center of the time. It looks so lovely. Let me get my other baking mitt. All right, so the things you want to look at are, you see how it's pulling away from the sides a little bit? That's what you want to see. And you see when I touch it in the middle, it bounces back. That's what you want. You want it to come back because that means it's baked all the way through. If you touch it and it sinks in and it doesn't come back up, that means it's still batter in the middle. And if you take that out and let it sit just a couple of minutes, it comes back down to room temperature, and then you can't just stick it back in the oven. Like, you are stuck with an undercooked cake and there's really no way to fix it. So you want to make sure that it's done in the middle, but you also don't want it to be burned. So that's sort of the challenge of baking, but I think we've got it. It looks really good. So now we're going to set our timer again for 10 minutes. And when that goes off, we are going to transfer it out of that cake pan. But first we're going to cut the dome off, and I'll show you how to do that. So Superman has been cooling for 10 minutes, and now I'm going to get to show you how to trim the top of your cake. So as you can see, the top of Superman has sort of cooked up a little too high, so we want that to be flat across, even with the sides of the cake pan, so that when you set it on your board to decorate, he sits flat instead of having like a big part. And you can also see here where his head, like I was telling you, the batter was not as thick out here at the edges, and so it's a little bit skinnier and not as deep over on the edge. That's fine. You're going to cover that up with frosting. Don't even worry about it. So there are two ways you can do this. You can get a bread knife like this that's serrated. You definitely want it to be serrated. You kind of lay it along the pan and just cut it like this. I'm going to show you the other way. This is a Wilton cake leveler, and you can move this wire to whatever level you need it to be at. In this case, it's like this, and you can just sort of drag it along the top. Unfortunately, on this cake, that's not going to work, as you can see, because this isn't wide enough, but you can use something like this on a skinnier cake, probably like Oscar the Grouch. This would work. So I'm going to go ahead and use the knife and do it the old-fashioned way. And since you're doing this while the cake is still kind of warm, it's very easy to slice. Your kitchen helpers will be extra excited about this part. This is the top of your cake rack. You're going to turn it upside down, set it right on the top of your cake, hold it very firmly, do not drop it on the floor, you'll be very sad, and flip this guy over, sort of. There we go. This is a Wilton turntable, and I find it very helpful to have. If you would like to use something else, you can. If you have any other kind of Lazy Susan, you can use that, or you can just put it on a regular cake stand and manually sort of turn it as you need it. But you just want to make sure that it's facing the easiest way for you to reach. Now, I made a cake board for this particular cake, and I did that for all of these cakes that you'll see me do today, just so that the presentation at the end is really nice. You can use wrapping paper, and I can actually do a separate video if anybody wants to see how to make these cake boards, but it's just so that you have something nice. You can use a really plain rectangular cake board as well. So whatever you would like to use, just as long as you have that ready, you're good to go. So now I'm going to, this is the cake pan obviously, so I'm going to remove that. So this is the direction that it's going to need to be facing, and we're going to get some frosting. So what you want is a dollop of frosting. This frosting has gotten really cold, but it's still going to do what we want it to do. By the time you get to this point, you will realize that these cakes are extremely delicate, so be very careful when transferring them from one thing to another. So the first thing that I like to do is go ahead and fill in any of the spots that are going to be far away, like background type shots or background type areas. In this case, it's between his arms and his waist here. You can use stars if you prefer. I just think that it's sort of a nice delineator to sort of use something that has a different texture. And as you can see, you can just kind of follow the outline. And it's easier if you kind of overlap into the area that you're trying to not go into. So for example, if you pull it up a little bit over onto his tummy and his arm, then when you cover that up with stars later, you won't have any gap. So it's nice and smooth. The biggest thing when you're using a spatula on these types of cakes, especially if you used a cake mix, is to not touch the cake, because these cakes are very crummy and you'll pull crumbs up into your frosting. So I have attached my tip with the coupling system, and now I'm going to do all of the outlines. Now I have decided that I prefer a black outline, but you can use, if you use the cake pattern, they tell you to use blue and then red, just the color that you're filling in with. So it's whatever you prefer to do, but I just think this gives it more of a comic book look. So here we go. When you're making these stars, you want to hold your arm up and down, straight up and down like this. Try not to tilt too much unless you're doing the sides. You want to hold it just above the cake. You don't want the star to be touching, the tip to be touching the cake. You want it to sort of have to drop down. You stop squeezing, so basically you hold it here, you squeeze until you see the star form, then you stop squeezing and then lift. And that way you won't get too many points, because if you keep squeezing as you lift, the star will come up and be elongated, and that's not the look that you want. If you're not really familiar with using tips, one thing you can do is practice on just a paper towel or a paper plate until you sort of get the feel of how you need to hold the bag. It's finally party day and the cakes are all done. So now let me walk you through the last minute details that I did on all of these cakes. So starting with Superman here, Superman came with a face that you could apply over because it's a little difficult to draw a face. And I just decided that I was gonna give it a shot because the cake, the face that came with the cake pan was a little oversized, and so it looked a little weird to sort of, it kind of fills up this whole area, and it doesn't look like he has a neck at all. So I was like, well, I'll give it a shot. I'll draw it on there, and if it looks terrible, I can just cover it up with the plastic face. So I think it looks pretty decent, although his jawline is a little out of control, but hey, he's a superhero, so it's fine. I think the red intensified really nicely because we stored it in the fridge for about a week, and so it's a lovely shade, and overall, I think he looks very heroic and tasty. Tasty, tasty. One side note, this cake is actually so large that I could not find anything to put it in to store it overnight. So we decided to put it in the cold oven just to keep our cats out of it and to keep any kind of dust or anything like that away from it. So that's an emergency storage solution from me to you. For Oscar here, I actually ran out of the correct color of the garbage can, so I luckily had some other icing left over from one of my other cakes and I filled it in. That shouldn't be a problem for you. It was just sort of a miscalculation on my part because I was making 3 cakes. Hopefully you won't ever be making 3 cakes at one time. The tip that I used for the fur on this little Muppety guy is actually really cool and pretty fun to use. I would just recommend trying it out on like a paper towel or a paper plate before you try to use it to get used to how much you have to pull and how much you sort of need to like stop squeezing and when you need to stop squeezing. So overall, I sort of redesigned the way that the piping was going to go onto the trash can because I just thought it looked a little bit messy the way that it was on the Wilton cake design, and I think that this is a really nice solution. Finally, for our pièce de résistance, which I said terribly, we have the Mandalorian. So I used the Boba Fett pan, and Tim told me that he really wanted a Mandalorian cake, and so I felt like that would be a fairly easy modification to the cake pan design, and so here it is. It's not the most colorful cake, so I added a little bit of green with some fun stars on the border, and I wrote, "Hi Tim," which of course there you could write whatever you want to write, but I think it's a fun twist on a classic design, and I think that Tim's going to be really happy when he sees it today. To redesign this cake, I basically found a cartoon drawing of the Mandalorian and some cartoon paintings of him online that showed the different color schemes, and just sort of drew it on there with the black outline and then colored it all in with the icing. And the hardest part was calculating how much of each color I was going to need without knowing exactly if I was getting that right. So I would say to err on the side of caution and make a little more of each color than you really need. That's probably in general a good idea for these types of cakes. I hope this tutorial was helpful for you. Share your experience down in the comments and let me know if you have any great Wilton memories that you'd like to share as well. Thanks for watching.